begin. As a first rebuttal speaker in this round, I'm going to be looking at the arguments that we've seen so far and specifically addressing the arguments and the responses to the second affirmative to my original arguments. But before we get into that, I want to look at the standard of the resolution of net benefits as I started out my last speech. Now, the basic response to this was we don't have to have that net benefit, any net benefit, not just a significant net benefit. And that essentially goes against what the resolution says. The resolution says that you must have a significant reform to the criminal justice system. When you have a significant reform, you have significant benefits. Either if it wasn't a significant benefit, you wouldn't do the reform. That's what the resolution states. A significant reform which has significant benefits. They're going against the resolution by simply saying, well, any benefit at all, even if it was one person, that would be a reason to pass their plan. And that bounces off my partner's masking disadvantage and why that's not really a practical standard for Congress to take. If they thought that any net benefit would work, if it just helped one person, they don't pass policies on that. They look at the significant overall effect of a plan. So it has to be significant net benefits. Let's look at that extra topicality argument. Now, I'd just like to point out that they kind of misconstrued my argument saying, well, they agree with our first mandate. I didn't agree with this in first mandate as in passing. I just agreed that it was under the federal criminal justice system. Now, the next argument under there was looking at the extra topical mandate. And this argument, well, it's a federal reform. The resolution says a federal reform. The resolution says a federal reform to its criminal justice system, not the state system. The systemic reform of that federal funding increase is the states. The response to this was basically, well, that's affecting the states. It's not really impacting the states. That reform is directly directed to the states. It's impacting the states. If it was all just, if it was a reform directly towards the federal criminal justice system and all the impacts were towards the federal justice system and there was just minor effects for the states, it wouldn't be extra topical. But all the impacts of that policy, and it's all directed toward the states. It is increasing state grants. The systemic reform is at a state level, and that mandate should be stricken from around. Let's move on to the argument of vagueness. And they basically said, well, it's impractical for us to show our funding and how we solve for that. We can't go through each 50 states. Well, you don't have to go through each individual 50 states. You can just simply quote for me the mechanism, your plan for deciding which states gets which amount of money. It's not that hard. And they basically said their next response to that, I asked them cross-examination, was, well, we really don't have a mechanism. We're leaving it up to Congress. And that is the worst thing you could possibly do if you're wanting to solve foreign advantages. If they are leaving it up for Congresses, they do not get solvency for any of their advantages because they don't solve that they will actually get the amount of money. It's up to Congress' interpretation to say in that capacity, since their mandates were so vague. It's up to Congress' interpretation if that's enough money for the states. It's up to Congress' interpretation if that's enough money for the federal government. It's not, it might be, in reality, it might not be the actual amount of money that is needed, but if they are, quote-unquote, leaving it up to Congress, if it was up to Congress, their plan would be passed already. Let's move on down to the next argument, looking at inherency. Now, the argument under here was essentially ignored. They basically said, well, the net benefits outweigh. Well, that wasn't the argument. They ignored the argument. The argument was this. Even if you expand to try and get net benefits, the majority will be kicked out of the program. That's what happens in the status quo, because they only look at low-level offenders. They ignored that argument. And under the vagueness argument, I'll just jump back real quick. They dropped my questions about even their federal mandate. What does that actually entice? What does that actually mean when they're increasing the capacity of? They need to specify specifically what their mandates mean. Moving on down to the solvency arguments. Now, basically, the first solvency argument is saying, well, if we expand this program, it'll stop cherry picking. But, quote, according to from the read on evidence that I read earlier, quote, even if drug courts were greatly in many courts where a defendant is permitted to enter drug court, it is up to the prosecutor. Prosecutors are frequently hesitant to allow higher risk offenders to participate in the programs. And quote, the problem is not expansion, it's the prosecutors thinking the people who are the easiest to succeed and ignoring the people who need help the most. That was not talking about expansion. The next argument under solvency is looking at the government accountability study. And I agree that is a very large study, so they should, if they have read it in the affirmative team, they should be able to show how it specifically took into account all of those areas. If that cost-effective study just took into account people who were successfully completing the program while ignoring the people we paid double for, the people who dropped out, then it's not cost-effective. They have to read from their study where it took into account the successful completion rates and the dropouts. Let's look at that final solvency argument. It was essentially dropped by the affirmative team. And what it said is that most of the, up to 75%, in some cases 75% of people who participated in drug courts dropped out. This is a very significant solvency argument that went unaddressed by the affirmative team. They also didn't address the impact of that, is that failure rates are opting for longer sentences. If you fail of the drug court program, you will get a longer sentence in prison, and that's why we pay double for those fallout rates. For all those arguments, for all the solvency, for the vagueness, for the disadvantages, and for the extra topicality of that mandate, I urge that you cast your ballot to the negative side at the today's debate round. Thank you.
Can I just have time?